All right, we'll continue talking about cocoa and chocolate. Now, a big issue in cocoa farming is child labor. Much cocoa production uses child labor, and governments and certification organizations have united to try to eliminate that, but not made much progress. The biggest report comes from NORC, which is a research group at the University of Chicago. They looked at 2018-2019. Child labor remains disturbingly common. Even forced labor, modern slavery, is sometimes reported, although fortunately not that often. The best estimate holds that about 1.5 million kids work in cocoa production in Ghana and Ivory Coast, approximately equal numbers. Doubtless more work in other places, but as we said, those are the two biggest producers, so that's where these reports tend to focus. Now, most of these kids worked on their family's farm, and the evidence suggests it's not uncommon. It seems nearly a majority of family farms use child labor of their own family. Now, sometimes when people hear about child labor, they imagine the factories of industrial revolution, something out of a Charles Dickens story where little kids worked at machinery. Now, it's generally not this sort going on here. These are small family farms that expect all the family members to contribute. A typical cocoa farm has 6 to 8 acres planted with cocoa. Yields are going to be usually under a ton of beans per acre, so these farms are generating, maybe under $8,000 per harvest. And that's top line revenue. They have to pay for their inputs from that. They're not making much income. In Ghana, most of the cocoa farmers are Ghanaian. In Ivory Coast, about a quarter are at Burkina from Burkina Faso, which borders. Of the child laborers, nearly half are estimated to be kids under 12, and then 30-20 split for those who are 12 to 14 and those 15 to 17. Now, why are those numbers important? Because international regulations stipulate that for kids under 12, any work is too much. That's child labor. For kids 12 to 14, they can work a limited number of hours, shouldn't be hazardous, and not too many hours. For kids 15 to 17 years old, they can work full-time, but shouldn't be hazardous work. Surveys find kids under 12 are working an average of about 8 hours a week on the farm during the harvest season. And, for all the kids, kids say that, that work interferes with their schooling. And let's be honest, better schooling is the key to escaping poverty. But many households explain that having kids work allows them to pay for things like school fees. So, it's not an easy problem. Now, it's worse that many of these kids are doing what's classified as hazardous labor. It's an issue even for the older kids who might be working, or might be allowed to work hours. In cocoa production, the most common hazardous tasks are using sharp tools, such as a machete, to weed, using sharp tools to break open the cocoa pods, then carrying heavy loads, chemical exposure, and land clearing. Chemical exposure is a broad category. It includes things like carrying water that's going to be used for spraying, or being in the vicinity when somebody else applying various chemicals. That category is obviously growing a lot because producers are using more fertilizer, more pesticides, more herbicide to keep down weeds. As we noted earlier, cocoa prices had recently been pretty flat for decades. The only way for farmers to survive is to use more technological interventions to raise yields, get more harvest from the same farm. But that conflicts with other goals of, keeping kids safe from these chemicals. So how do we know the extent of child labor? Simple surveys are honestly difficult. Governments have a lot of rules and regulations that prohibit child labor. Many certification programs, like fair trade or things, when the growers get a better price for their crop, they also prohibit child labor. So if some stranger walks up to a farmer and says, "Hi, how you doing? Are you doing illegal things or something that could lose you a lot of money?" Well, it's actually surprising how many people answer honestly when the answers could get them into a lot of trouble. That might actually give some insight about how little many people feel bad about having their kids help out on the family farm. But some surveys also come up with clever alternatives to just ask people to self-report about how often are you breaking the law. A list experiment is an interesting method. This question, from an article by Marine Jouvin, published in 2024, gave these instructions. Please put your hand behind your back. I'm going to read 3 or 4 statements about the labor used on your cocoa farm in the last 12 months. If the statement that's read is true and applies to your case, lift finger behind your back. If the statement's not true, do not lift finger. After I read all the statements, show me your hand and the number of fingers you raised. I don't want to know which statements apply, only the number of statements that are true. Don't answer yes or no when I read statements. Your answers are supposed to remain confidential. So it's a little bit complicated, but I found that most people could understand the basic process. So then the interviewer would ask, for instance, during the last campaign for harvesting and breaking the pods, 1, no woman over 16 helped me. 2, at least one member of my family helped me. 3, 1 or more people under 16 helped. 4, a group of communal laborers helped. In total, how many statements apply to your case? But this is a crucial part. They would randomly ask the third question to only half the participants. From the difference in the average number of responses from each group, we can estimate the fraction who answered yes to that question about child labor. You can't tell any particular person did or did not, but you can see the average distinction. Now, I think a good deal of the child labor problem is not so much ruthless businesses exploiting children, but that poor farmers are exploiting themselves and their families, trying to just make it in the world. Recall the price of a ton of cocoa beans was about $2,000 40 years ago and was still around that price of just a few years ago. But, inflation has been ongoing. $2,000 bought a lot more 40 years ago. Here's a graph of GDP per capita, so that's per person, in Ivory Coast, Ghana, and some of their neighbors in West Africa. The numbers are adjusted for inflation, so we can make comparisons that are more relevant over time. And see, all these countries are quite poor. You see the Ivory Coast and Ghana have been doing better in recent years. I'm going to put these numbers into perspective. $4,000 a year is not a lot. Think of countries that some CCNY students might know a little bit better. Bangladesh has been growing quite fast. Back in 2017, that had about similar GDP per person as Ghana. Other countries you might know, Mexico or Dominican Republic, those have GDP per person maybe 4 times higher. And DR, of course, has been growing really fast recently, so they're a strong upward trend. Now this graph shows child mortality on the vertical axis and GDP per person on the horizontal. Now both axes are in logs, so that compresses down the extremes. The countries are joined up to show the change over the period since 1950, and we can see a lot of progress. The gray lines are other countries around the world, just reminding there's a strong negative correlation. Getting richer means fewer kids die. Ivory Coast is down to 6.7%, Ghana down to 3.9%. Those are still very high. Developed countries are 10th or even 100th of that. But on the other hand, they are much better than 1 in 3 when some of these data started. So that's a tremendous improvement. Now, just by the way, this data is from Our World in Data. It's a terrific resource to explore. Definitely worth your time. Now, the final question is whether consumers are indeed willing to pay extra for the certification that the chocolate was not produced by child labor. There have been some studies, and the answer is meh. On average, people seem to be willing to pay a little bit, but just a little. There are a few issues. Part is that certification usually bundles up a bunch of things a consumer care about at least a little. It's organic, it's fair trade, supports local communities, and not produced by child labor. So it can be difficult to figure out which single item on that list is important to consumers or kind of all important. On the flip side, surveys such as that list experiment find that many farms which are certified as being free from child labor actually aren't. In Ghana, about 16% of cocoa is certified. In Ivory Coast, maybe 30% is. So while the use of child labor is lower on certified farms, it's not nearly zero. So you could make conclusions of some combination of, well, consumers don't actually care that much about child labor. Plus, perhaps they realize the certification isn't all that meaningful, so they're not willing to pay for something that's not as enforced. For myself, I have to say I'm kind of torn. It would be a better world if kids didn't have to work. But the preponderance of child labor seems to indicate these farm households think it's okay. My family were farmers. I've heard grandparents talk about farm life. Everybody worked. There's a distinction. There's a continuum there. Maybe it's not unlike kids doing chores today. These farmers are very poor. They're trying to make a bit of money to help their whole family. Trying to survive from farming, that's tough. Most of the child labor is from kids working for their own family on the family farm. It, sometimes seems like folks in the rich world come in with their own ideas and standards and want to tell the folks in a developing country just what they should be doing. Plus, of course, there's racism. It's not a coincidence. The typical consumers are white, farm workers are black. The governments of Ghana and Ivory Coast are sensitive to the desires of chocolate consumers, so they say the right things about trying to eliminate child labor. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of change on those farms. So we will see how that plays out in the future. A final aspect of cocoa that we want to discuss is the LID, Living Income Differential. In 2019, the two countries that dominate the cocoa market, Ghana and Ivory Coast, said together those are about 70% of total exports, they decided they would charge an extra $400 per ton called the Living Income Differential to recognize the world price of cocoa beans did not allow farmers to make enough to, live on. At the time, the price of cocoa was $2,000 or $2,500 a ton, so an extra $400 was a good-sized bump. Recall earlier I'd shown the prices from 2012 to 2022. There I've drawn a vertical line to mark 2019. You'd be hard-pressed to find differences before or after. I'm just saying here. So did the living income differential do anything? It's tough to see anything in the overall price. We know in 2024 cocoa prices spiked really high, but it's implausible to believe that was due to a policy from 5 years ago. Economists did research looking at the particular prices these two countries got. Ordinarily their beans would trade at a premium. But cocoa beans are very much a commodity. Now, in the very short term, producers want a steady supply and they had to absorb some cost increase. But in the medium to long term, they'll find substitutes. And that's what we see happening. The government said, hey, we passed a new law, you're going to pay us $400 more, so instead of the ordinary price of $2,500, you'll pay $2,900 instead. And the cocoa processors said, they paid something like $2,900 to get immediate deliveries, but then started to shop around. And eventually the negotiation was more like, so we're going to pay you $2,100, which with $400 extra means you get $2,500. And the country said, no, we want more. And the producer said, okay, then we won't buy from you. It's a global commodity market. Governments tried to limit sales to keep prices higher, but then they faced the problem of storing the unsold beans. And then in 2020, there was this global pandemic and a lot of other things happened and things got complicated and ugly. Now, to be clear, there's ample precedent for governments deciding that they want to pass a law to repeal the laws of economics. The U.S. has been doing that with tariffs, claiming the cost increases won't be passed along. Foreigners will be the one to pay. The bottom line is before the LID policies, those countries got a premium for their cocoa. After the LID went into effect, the name of that premium changed, but the total amount of money changing hands didn't really change that much. I know this is all really complicated. Learning information about various facets of cocoa and global capitalism, go have some chocolate. It'll help.